Welcome. I'm Wendy Chapkus, the chair of the Sociology program at USM. And you can't imagine how delighted I am to see everybody in the body. It's been amazing. The last time I was in this room was March of 2020. And as fate would have it, it was for a subversions lecture that I was giving at that time. The next day, the campus closed down and everything went online. So it's wonderful to circle back again and be here with you again. I'm also really glad, though, that we have Zoom in our toolbox because I'm very happy that there are people watching this online around the state and elsewhere. So welcome to everyone online. It's my great pleasure to introduce David Everson. Professor Everson received his PhD in sociology from the University of Notre Dame, and he joined the USM faculty in 2017. At USM, he teaches a range of courses from our introductory course to advanced electives in areas like sociology of the environment, which we'll be teaching in the spring, and sociology of Indigenous peoples, which he's teaching right now. His research focus is settler colonialism, social movements, and Indigenous sovereignty. I'm so grateful to have him as a colleague. And welcome, David.
Thanks so much, Wendy, for that warm introduction. It's always baffling to me to hear that I've been here since fall of 2017. The time has been a really great flow since I arrived way out here far from home. And that's a testament to my colleagues, both in sociology and economics, who provided such a wonderful and comfortable environment for me to thrive in. And of course, the deans and everyone else here, right? Welcome, we're already moving along. Okay, what's going on here? Sure. As my students know, I like to pace around, so this will be a challenge. Welcome again, as Wendy mentioned, to all of you who are here in person. Welcome to those following along online. My name is David. I was originally scheduled to give this talk in April of 2020 before the pandemic derailed those plans. I'm happy to announce in the interim that this project and this paper went from a work in progress to a work in press. So this was published a couple months ago in the Sociology of Race and Ethnicity. You should be able to access this via Ursus if you're interested in the talk and want to learn more. Hopefully you won't get the UMO only barrier message when you sign on to Ursus for this, but if you do, feel free to message me or talk to me afterwards, and I'm happy to send you along a copy. So my purpose in this paper is to attempt to develop a theory of racial discourse, which is related to how the dominant culture rationalizes its advantages, right? Particularly within contexts of durable and severe racial inequalities. As you can tell from the title of the talk, the title of the paper, my particular focus is on the racial narratives that encompass the white native racial order, right? And I'm interested in the racial narratives that are used in opposition to pursuits for Indigenous sovereignty. So that's what I'll be talking to you about today. Let me give you a little bit of structure in terms of how I'm going to approach this. I'm going to start with a little background of the project. First, tell you about my personal relationship to the project, which tells you a little bit not only about the field sites, but also about sort of the realities of being a settler descendant in the United States. Place this within the relevant sociological literature. I'm going to move on to tell you about the theoretical framework that I developed, which is based off two essential bodies of work, one being that of settler colonial theory, and the second being Charles Tilley's work on durable inequality. I will say that I've stripped out some of the theoretical and conceptual jargon, so this is palatable to both a sociological and non-sociological audience. So if, again, you're into that esoteric language, you can read the article for more. I can, again, send it along to you. I'll tell you about my methodology, including my case study, which is the American Indian movement, particularly its confrontational protest in the late 1960s and 1970s. The data that I use for this paper is follow-up interviews but that sample will only make sense if I tell you a little bit about the archival data collection that I did a number of years ago. I'm going to then tell you about the findings. I uncovered two what I call privileged narratives. The first related to the denial of Indigenous sovereignty and land rights, which I labeled tribal warfare. The second related to rationalizations of white Native inequality and justifications of Native poverty, which I labeled the reservation wasteland narrative. Then I'll wrap it up with some conclusions. I want to start, though, again, with my personal relationship to this project. So I'm originally from the tallgrass prairie of eastern South Dakota, where prior to European settlement, the grasses and wildflowers and sedges would grow up to 8 feet tall. This, of course, all changed as settlers arrived. And within a few generations, what Walt Whitman termed the characteristic American landscape was pretty much nearly totally destroyed, right? So it's estimated that in this conversion to agriculture, there's remnants of maybe 2% left of this ecosystem, the outlines of which you see here on this map. Now, the decimation of the ecological system on the northern plains, of course, tracked the divestment of the indigenous land base, right? So South Dakota, what's now called South Dakota, is the traditional homelands of the Oshedi-Shakoween, what the dominant culture typically refers to as the Sioux Nation. You see prior to treaties in 1851 and 1868, the Oshedi-Shakoween land base encompassed all of South Dakota, including and expanding into other portions, for example, south to the Platte River, and so on and so forth. Today, the Oshedi-Shakoween land base in South Dakota is comprised of 9 reservations. You have the Dakota tribe in the east, the Nakota tribe in the south by the Missouri River near Yankton, and the western part of the Missouri River, you have the Lakota tribes, right, where, again, higher populations exist within that part of the state. Now, South Dakota has roughly about 10% of the population that's indigenous, right? It's one of the highest per capita of any state in the country. So it produces this rather interesting racial context. Across the state of South Dakota, you have these large concrete teepees around various parts, often located off of interstates. This one is located off of Interstate 29 in the southeast part of the state near the University of South Dakota in Vermillion. And this one is labeled the Homestead Rest Area. So what's interesting, when you move under this teepee, which is presumably a tribute to the Oshedi-Shakoween tribes, you see a plaque dedicated to the Homestead Act, right? And details here this individual who's alleged to be the first to file a claim. So that would come into full effect January 1st, 1863, after President Lincoln signs this legislation in May of 1862. Now, if you're unfamiliar, the Homestead Act provided 160 acres, essentially of free land, to settlers willing to improve it, right, in the Lockean agrocentric sense of mixing your labor with the land, converting it to agriculture, right? In all, this estimated that the Homestead Act encompassed about 10% of the territorial land base in this country, mostly west of the Mississippi River, in all about 270 million acres. Now, I foreground this act not just to note the ironies of that homestead rest area, or to show you one of the policy mechanisms for the large-scale disenfranchisement of indigenous tribes from their land in this area, but indeed because my ancestors and myself personally benefited from the Homestead Act, like countless others who grew up west of the Mississippi, right? So you see here on the left, this is the homestead deed for my great-great-grandfather, Hugh Ching, who at the time, Dakota Territory. You see this was signed in 1888 by Grover Cleveland, documenting the 160 acres and, of course, detailing a section of land, right, where this 160 acres encompass. Now, this land, this farm is still in my family, right? My uncle still farms this land today. So you see then the cumulative advantages, right, that were passed down to European settlers and their Euro-American descendants. Now, in addition to the Homestead Act, the other major piece of, again, transferring or redistributing land from indigenous peoples to settlers was the Dawes Act. You also see this as the General Allotment Act. And this essentially applied the logic of the Homestead Act to reservations, right? The ideal was to break up communal landholdings of the tribe into individualized plots of again, 160 acres. Conveniently enough, after the government did this, there was a lot of surplus, so-called surplus of lands that wasn't divided out, which were then appropriated and sold off to settlers. As a result of this Dawes Act from 1887 to 1934, when we get the Indian Reorganization Act under President Roosevelt's administration, you have nearly 70% of the overall tribal land base that is gone, right? Now, here's the other side of my family, right? This is, you see later on, 1919. On my father's ancestral side, Edward Everson, you probably can't read this. It says E.H. Everson, purchaser of land included in the allotment of Susan Milk, right? When I was researching this a number of years ago, I came across the information that Susan Milk was a member of the Yankton Sioux tribe, right? And again, I provide these examples to show that, again, as a settler descendant, I'm very much grounded, right, literally, in these contradictory historical processes which distributed advantage to my European and Euro-American ancestors, only at the, of course, disadvantage of the tribal peoples of the region, right? And that shapes, of course, who I am, that shapes how I got here, that shapes how I see myself in this society. And no doubt it informs my research and work in pursuit of Indigenous sovereignty, whether it's in South Dakota or out here in Maine. Okay, so now to place this in the sociological literature. The sociologists have actually a lot to say about racism, race ethnicity, and so on and so forth, right? And I would say that most of the best work out there right now on race comes from sociology. And it's sort of frustrating when I hear mainstream discourse on the subject, which seems like sociologists were discussing 30 years ago, right? But all that's to say, despite this broad race ethnicity literature, there's not a lot of focus on Indigenous peoples, right? Now, we need to be careful here, right? We can't just lump Indigenous communities into, of course, this broader mosaic of racialized groups, right, within American society. Indigenous nations, of course, have inherent treaty-based rights, sovereignty, a unique relationship with the federal government, right? Unless you're a tribe in Maine, where now, because of the Land Claims Settlement Act, you have the state that's interceding that direct relationship, right? In addition, what I was reading in the sociological literature on race, the work on colorblind racism from Bonilla Silva, it didn't line up with what I was hearing, right? When I was back home reading editorials about Lakota treaty rights to the Black Hills, or being involved in conversations about sovereignty amongst the tribes, right? So for that reason, my intention here is to have an understanding of the particular nature of the racial narratives that are, again, surrounding Indigenous communities and the pursuit of Indigenous sovereignty. Now, I mentioned colorblind racism. I'll just tell you a little bit of it here so you have a slight background. You probably all heard the term, particularly common after Obama was elected, right? The idea that the contemporary landscape, the post-civil rights landscape of racism is that it's largely gone covert, right? Now, this again comes from the excellent work of Eduardo Bonilla Silva, all written before the previous administration too. But that it's typically coded through the ideology and the discourse of liberal capitalism, right? So rather than being overtly racially hostile now, what you often get is that you get a discussion of racial inequalities, a discussion of poverty amongst racialized groups, sort of framed within the broader mosaic again of you know, that individual doesn't want to work, right? They don't have a sufficient work ethic, right? They don't want to hold a job, they just want to live off government assistance. That's easily transposed onto a broader cultural group, as I heard a lot, right? When I was doing these interviews, a lot of folks saying that, you know, the reason for the high levels of poverty on Native reservations is that Native Americans just don't want to work, they'd rather live off government assistance, right? So there's no doubt that that colorblind racism is still common and prevalent, not just amongst non-Indigenous racialized groups, but amongst Indigenous groups as well. So the big question. Of course, in my classes, my students know I talk a lot about the racial wealth gap. That's often framed in terms of the black-white gap, which is, of course, devastatingly high. A lot of these trends often look worse when we bring Indigenous peoples into this subject, right? So, you know, the tribes in Minnesota tend to have about a poverty rate about 3 times the national level. The tribes, particularly in the western part of South Dakota, west of the Missouri River, oftentimes those reservations are encompassing the poorest counties in the country, right? And again, the interesting thing here is that there's that reality happening, but there's also the reality of the Lakota tribes in the region being very active, right? In terms of the pursuit of sovereignty, in terms of changing the names of mountains, right? So we had Harney Peak, which I grew up going to all the time, now called Black Elk Peak, right? Which of course the non-Indigenous culture just is so incensed about. So my bigger questions here are how, amidst this context, right? How does the dominant culture rationalize these inequalities on one hand? In addition, how do they rationalize their opposition to Indigenous sovereignty and land rights? Right? Okay, to tell you a bit about the theoretical framework here. As I mentioned, I draw from 2 main sources. First, settler colonial theory. The best work I've come across on race, on racism, racialization, as it's connected to the colonial project is Patrick Wolf's book, Traces of History. Can't recommend it enough. In addition to work from Wolf and Veracini, which of course my students are hopefully enjoyed reading, I borrow from Charles Tilley's work on durable inequality about the implanting of long-term inequalities and where those come from. Let's start with Wolf. Wolf distinguishes colonialism from settler colonialism by their organizing logics, right? When we think about colonialism, Wolf argues we're thinking about the organizing logic of exploitation. The goal is to control labor and land for the extraction of wealth, right? To siphon back to the colonizing state. In contrast, the settler colonial project in states like the United States, Canada, New Zealand, is driven by the logic of elimination, right? And elimination gets to the eradication of the Indigenous populations on the territory because, as Patrick Wolf says, for settler colonial projects, land is life, right? We know, of course, that many of us grow up learning about the Trail of Tears and the forced removal of the Southeast tribes to then Indian Territory, now Oklahoma. We know that forced removal was, of course, carried out so that the slave-based cotton economy in the South could be implanted. Okay, from Charles Tilley, when we're thinking about, again, these long-term racial inequalities, which never seem to budge too much, right? Tilley argues that based on, of course, categorical distinctions, in my case, of course, this idea of race, right? There are 2 central mechanisms that, again, institutionalize these long-term inequalities. First, exploitation, right? where a powerful network controls the labor necessary for extracting value from a resource, but of course is withholding the full value of that resource from the laborers. And second, what he calls opportunity hoarding. And this is when a network controls and monopolizes a valuable and renewable resource. Okay? So when we think about the establishment of settler colonialism in this society, right, we think about the dual logics of racial dispossession, right? Essentially, these dual logics that I argue we can apply to Tilley's framework, right? We think about the dual logics, again, of indigenous elimination in the pursuit of hoarding indigenous resources, which is ongoing. And we think about the exploitation of non-indigenous racialized bodies. Prime example, of course, being black chattel slavery, but we could give others. Wolf has what I think is this great succinct quote in his book, where he says, the application of black people's labor to red people's land produced the white man's property, a primitive accumulation if there ever was one. So my argument, right, is again centering these two primary forms of racialized dispossession, exploitation of non-indigenous racialized bodies, and the opportunity hoarding of indigenous resources. Now, make no mistake about it, of course, in targeting indigenous land, indigenous bodies were also targeted routinely, right? But again, the primary motivation, setting up those, what Black Hawk calls indigenous bodies in pain, was the pursuit of territory. So I propose, right, that these two central mechanisms of racial dispossession produce variation in the contemporary discourses of white privilege. This gets thrown around all the time, just how the dominant culture rationalizes, again, its advantages, right? This is likely to lead to a corporeal-based narrative and a dispossession that hit the body, right? This is likely, as I argue, to lead to a territorial rationalization because of the mechanism that hit the land, that hit territory. So let me explain that a little bit more. Again, because exploitation, for instance, slavery, occurred on deterritorialized bodies, right? Racialized discourse can remain amenable to these flexible, ahistoric, spatially disembedded storylines, right? And this, of course, is perfectly congruent with colorblind racism. And what Bonilla Silva argues, one of the dominant strands of that is, again, this focus on liberalism. Liberal capitalism doesn't care about our histories. It doesn't care about our stories. It doesn't care about where we're from, right? So this, again, colorblind racism is this flexible corporeal narrative that can easily be attached to different racialized groups, right? And again, as I say here, colorblindness is liberal economic vilifications. They attach seamlessly to bodies that have been materially and symbolically appended to a placeless capitalist market. And to get back to an earlier point, it's not surprising that the sociology literature would be so replete with examples and focus on colorblind, because there is so little focus on indigenous peoples and the indigenous experience. So in contrast to those rationalizations, I argue that the ongoing hoarding of indigenous resources requires narrations that historically legitimate the dominant culture's territoriality, right? And the main point being here is that, right, if I'm Euro-American in Western South Dakota living in the Black Hills, and I'm not so stoked about the Lakota trying to press these land claims, I can still draw from, right, these hegemonic discourses, colorblind racism, right? But when it gets to territory, right, when they start challenging my own home and the land it's on, they don't work so well, right? those rationalizations that are focusing on, again, how individuals or cultures are lazy, don't want to work, et cetera, that doesn't really translate, right? So in contrast to those narratives, my argument is that in legitimating, right, or in opposing indigenous sovereignty and claims to land, this discourse must continue to rationalize the historical foundations of non-indigenous property, right? Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about my methodology. As I mentioned here, the case study is the American Indian movement, particularly their confrontational protest in the late 1960s, early 1970s. AIM was formed in the Phillips neighborhood of South Minneapolis in 1968, originally established an AIM patrol to monitor police harassment and abuse for the large urban Indian population in the city. Numerous events you may have heard of: Trail of Broken Treaties, vandalism of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, when they're trying to get the attention of Richard Nixon, who was concerned with Watergate, right? It's sort of its pinnacle, its public sort of, the apex of its public exposure was, of course, the 71-day occupation of the Wounded Knee Village in South Dakota, which brought widespread media exposure. Polls at the time showed that over 90% of the American public were following the Wounded Knee massacre. The US military, of course, responded with a full range of covert and overt powers to suppress the Wounded Knee occupation, tied up a lot of the activists in court. I also just wanted to mention here, oftentimes in the media or in other in other accounts of this, AIM and Red Power tend to be conflated, where AIM was sort of one militant flank of this broader effort of tribal activism, grassroots organizations, national organizations, and so on and so forth. AIM's grievances were summed up in what they called the 20-point position paper they brought with them on the Trail of Broken Treaties, hoped to present to President Nixon, which really focused and centered treaty rights and tribal sovereignty. So my goal here was, again, to use this as a case to analyze how the dominant culture responds to this protest for indigenous rights, right? Not just protest, but really sort of AIM was willing to be confrontational. AIM was willing to be in your face, right? As they were in many places in South Dakota and Minnesota. So my focus here is on those non-native in the social movements literature called these bystanders, who are proximate to the protest, right? It's not someone on the East Coast who's reading about Wounded Knee in the New York Times. It's someone who was there at the time. And indeed, many of my interviewees witnessed directly AIM protest events, right? Or at a riot were either at a riot in the Black Hills or Sioux Falls, or had to go get their kids from school because there was this riot happening. Let me tell you about the archival data, which again is how I recruited my interview sample. One summer during graduate school, I spent a lot of time at the Minnesota Historical Society and at the University of South Dakota. I pulled all the constituent letters that I could, those at the time folks who were writing into the governor of South Dakota, or Walter Mondale, about AIM, and transcribed how they were framing either their opposition or support of the movement. As I mentioned, one of the most effective mechanisms for the federal government to suppress AIM was to tie the activists up in court. So there was a number of trials, and I was able to locate these. This is an example of the cover sheet for one of them. These transcripts of what's called this voir dire process, when the prosecution and defense are going through their questioning to figure out whether they can get a potentially sympathetic juror or not in these preemptory strikes. I also pulled a bunch of public opinion surveys that this local grassroots organization did with the same intent of trying to get sympathetic jurors. Now, the key thing here, right? I gave you an example here of one of the voir dire transcripts. Adeline Clark, who was 67 at the time, of course, no longer with us. So I feel like it's okay to put her name up here. But Adeline from Silver City, South Dakota, this would be the cover sheet that would give me some information, and then her narratives, her response to questions would be appended to this. But the key was that this constituent mail, these juror transcripts, all had this publicly available personal identifiers on them, right? So I had this idea in the archive one day to try to track as many of these folks down as I could, right? I knew 40 years had passed, but through, you know, ancestry.com and the white pages and let's see, other sources, I will admit obituaries were actually really useful because it would often list the survivors, right? I was able ultimately, after I sent out a bunch of recruitment letters, to pull 47 individuals to talk to me. So those individuals who, again, their attitudes toward AIM, their narratives, not just to AIM, but toward sort of more broadly Native white relations in US society, were all documented back in the 1970s, right? What this allows me to do, and this is a separate project, it allows me, of course, to compare what they were saying about the movement back then and what they're saying 40 years later. And it allows me to get at the dominant memory of the American Indian movement. Not surprisingly, most of the folks, particularly those who are close to the activism, remember vividly the disruption, right? Remember having to go pick up their kids from school, not so much remembering the grievances of AIM or why they were there, right? And again, this obviously low response rate comes from the fact that 40 years had elapsed. Many of my potential recruits had passed. Altered maiden names made it a particular challenge to recruiting female participants. But regardless, I was able to track down 47. So I did these follow-up interviews with these 47 individuals in Minnesota and South Dakota, focusing primarily on what they thought of the validity of AIM's grievances as they relate to treaty rights, as they relate to land claims, whether it's the Black Hills in South Dakota, whether it's the rivers and waters in northern Minnesota. I also asked them about what they thought generally about the root causes of white native inequality. Okay, here's some of the findings. Again, through these interviews, focusing both on land rights and focusing on white native inequality, I heard two narratives that were recurrent, right? That came up over and over again amongst those who were antagonistic to the movement. Now, of course, all the interviewees that I talked to weren't antagonistic. Many of them were sympathetic, right? But of those who were antagonistic to AIM and their claims, about over half, 10 of the 19, gave me some version of what I label this tribal warfare narrative. And in this narrative, I'm going to show you some examples. They're more in the paper, but I'll show you some examples here. Interviewees, when asked about, for instance, Lakota claims to the Black Hills, interviewees often constructed this moral equivalent, right? Between what was happening amongst tribes prior to European settlement and what happened with the frontier violence of European colonization. Second, when we get to white native inequality, indigenous poverty, 11 of the 19 antagonists gave me some version of this, what I label this reservation wasteland narrative. These interviewees argued that it was the worthless and barren reservation land that was to blame for these high rates of poverty on the reservations. So I'm going to give you a few examples of these, and I want to tell you what type of work they're doing in terms of the power that they're doing to, again, sort of unsettle indigenous claims. Okay, let's start with tribal warfare. Brian says they, the American Indian movement, were mad about Wounded Knee, referring to the 1890 Wounded Knee massacre, where over 300 Lakota civilians were killed by the 7th Cavalry. They were mad about Wounded Knee. They have grievances. There's no two ways about that. But I didn't say, what about the Arikaras that you killed? There aren't many around here because the Sioux drove them off. These peace-loving Sioux acquired this land the same way that we whites did. Greg in the Black Hills and Custer said, I can't change what white people did. I can't change the fact that the Sioux took the Black Hills from another Indian tribe the same way the white man took it from them. Jeffrey in the eastern side of the state near the Flandreau Reservation. Who did the Lakota take them from? The Black Hills. They were pushed in. They came in here with the Cheyenne and other tribes, and then the tribes weren't very nice to each other. My God, they killed each other. They didn't have some utopian civilization where things were cool. They were going at each other. Finally, Sheldon. The Black Hills are sacred to me too, but they are not theirs, the Lakota, any more than they are mine. They don't have any more claim to it than the Arikara or the Crow or anybody else that got pushed out farther west. So again, I want to make a few points of emphasis here to show you what these narratives are doing, right? First off, you see the moral equivalent that's constructed between conflict amongst tribes, right? Or alleged conflicts amongst tribes and the process of European settlement. You also, right? You see that the respondents are pushing back the horizon, right? On claims to land, on indigenous claims to land. Back way before, right? For instance, there's no discussion here of the Fort Laramie Treaty, or there's indeed a delegitimization of their claims to the Black Hills, which the US Supreme Court has ruled was taken illegally, and a compensation fund now over $1.5 billion continues to accrue, right? So they're pushing, again, the horizons back, right? In order to invalidate what are, again, legally binding treaty rights to this territory. The other thing I want to point out here, you see this verb in a couple instances here, there's more of it in the paper, right? And the verb is pushed, right? They don't have any more claim to it than the Arikara, Crow, or anybody else that got pushed out farther west. They were pushed in, the Lakota were pushed in. And this language is interesting, right? Because it's constructing a non-agentic frame around the tribes in the region, right? If something's pushed around, it implies that it's not territorially rooted, right? And of course, there's no sort of discussion here about how advancing European settlement from the east pushed tribes west into others' traditional territory, right? Which caused some of this conflict. But this pushed idea, this sort of non-rooted, right, frame around the tribal peoples is sort of a similar to a practice we have in the dominant culture, where I say, for instance, that, you know, I live in Portland, Maine, right? But I say, my friend Craig lives on the Pine Ridge Reservation. When I say that I live in the United States or I live in Portland, Maine, it implies that I'm deeply rooted here, right? When we say people live on the reservation, it implies an entity that could be pushed off much more easily, right? When the next fossil fuel permitting process comes along, right? So there's a lot of things going on here. And again, more examples of this in the paper. But interesting how this discourse was so prevalent, right? Now, let's go to discussions of white native inequality, native poverty. Owen in Sioux Falls said, reservations are a total mess. Look at the land they're on. That's the most worthless wasteland in the country. Suzanne says, the Pine Ridge Reservation doesn't look like farmland or ranch land, just wide open spaces. Pretty worthless, actually. It really just looks like a bunch of worthless green land where they can't make a living and can't raise decent crops. Frank in Vermilion, southeast part of the state, says, we stuck them on little, and it's not even good land. It's the worst part of the state. We ought to have gave them the Black Hills from the beginning, not the little wastelands. They probably would have been more productive. Ruth, we took away their lands, took away what was theirs, and gave them some yucky land for them to live on and expect them to make a living. But a lot of them don't have to live on the reservation. They can go out, get a job, and support themselves just like we do. Finally, Jeffrey and Flandreau, I think the sooner we get done with the damn reservation system, you live there because you want to, not because you have to. Get the tribal members off the reservation. Give them the freedom to go where they please. So a couple, again, points of emphasis to own in on what these narratives are doing. First of all, I discussed colorblind racism, right? It's not that it's not present here. It is, right? Suzanne, they can't make a living and can't raise decent crops. Frank, they probably would have been more productive, right? They can go out and get a job and support themselves just like we do, of course, implying that they don't, right? So colorblind language, right, is still present, but it's subsumed under this territorial narrative, right? It's the territorial deficit, the deficit of the land, that is, again, causing the tribal peoples in the region to not be able to get out of poverty, right? The other thing I want to emphasize here is the proposed solution. You see it here on the last two. There are more examples in the paper. What's the proposed solution? Because of this alleged barren land, get tribal members off the reservation, right? Once again, uproot tribal peoples from land, unsettle the indigenous land claim, right? In terms, again, of getting rid of the reservation system, there's a bunch of folks who said, you know, we got to abolish the reservation system, and so on and so forth. So my argument here is that both narratives are essentially ending up in the same place, right? What both narratives are doing is that they're affirming settler territoriality by uprooting, unsettling indigenous territoriality, right? Whether it's denying indigenous land claims based on some historical narrative of prior tribal conflict, right? Or it's arguing that the land can't sustain the tribes, they should leave it, right? In both instances, again, it's unsettling, it's uprooting the tribal peoples from place. This, as I mentioned, to get back to my theoretical story, these narratives, again, reflect this racial discourse that has to still defend the historical foundations of non-indigenous property. Right. Which, of course, doesn't have to, this is the type of discourse that typically those trying to defend their advantages don't have to engage in with other racialized groups. So, final takeaway here. Dewana McKay talks about the legitimized racism that indigenous peoples confront in this society, the legitimized racism embodied by mascots, embodied by cultural appropriation. Philip Deloria has a great book called Playing Indian, I would recommend. In addition to that, in addition to colorblind racism, what I'm also arguing here is that Native peoples and those in support of the pursuit of Native sovereignty also have to confront these strategic historical narratives that are delegitimizing indigenous sovereignty, right? This highlights, of course, the importance of well-crafted pro-sovereignty counter-narratives that, again, can sort of continue to foreground the actual legal rights within the treaties with the federal government. That's all I have. Thanks so much. Happy to take questions. I think we have time. I'm not sure what time it is. Libby. You got it. Right. That's right. That's right. Excellent question. And yes, I'll try to repeat that question. So the question was the really interesting, fleshed out, detailed narratives that my respondents are giving me, focused on multiple tribes, focused on multiple tribal conflicts, again, that are alleged to predate this tribal settlement. Where that comes from, perhaps it comes from the educational socialization of folks in the region, perhaps it comes from intercultural contact. So there's a lot of interesting things to say there. One, yes, it totally defies most of the literature, which argues that it's typically what you get in these frontier narratives are these Manichaean, homogenous indigenous tribes versus white settlers. That focus on tribal detail, oftentimes, at least I haven't seen it in many studies. The other interesting thing here from my study is that none of those narratives were in the historical data, right? I maybe pulled it out once. Now they're extremely prevalent in 2015, right, when I'm doing these interviews. I went back and did some research, and I think a part of the answer is that it's a context of high racial contestation between the Lakota and the non-natives in the region. You pick up the Rapid City Journal, the main newspaper for Rapid City, which is a town of, I suppose, 70,000, much like Portland. You're constantly, like the non-native folks are constantly reading about these challenges and these prods from the Lakota, right? So there's that. There's the Black Hills claim, which of course, again, the Supreme Court has supported. But when I did some research, it was interesting. While AIM was pushing for during this time and briefly after this period, the Wounded Knee Massacre, you started getting a lot of newspaper editorials in the local papers with, invited scholars or invited historians who were discussing the legality of Lakota claims to the Black Hills. And this narrative I started finding in the newspapers where, well, really, they say it's theirs, but they came from the East, they came from northern Minnesota. And eventually, again, is it theirs? Is it Cheyenne? Is it the Crow? And these editorials would specifically mention these other tribes who are known to have some historical association to the region. My hunch is that this reflects a context in which a movement has disrupted the previous racial status quo, which then is leading to the dominant culture having to rework its narratives, right? Realizing that its old narratives, again, the ones I was finding in my historical data, not so good at resisting this type of claim, right? And that we need to come up with something, again, that's more powerful, that will invalidate the potential that my land will come under dispute, right? Now, what would be interesting to do is to study at a more deep level some of the non-native Maine narratives around the land claims because of different, of course, contexts, different histories. You have the plains where a lot of tribes are getting pushed out that way with as settlement goes west. They're probably different, but you may find sort of some similar language, right? I hope that answered your questions. It's a great one, and one it's one I've thought about a lot. Yeah, Paige. Thanks, Paige. So if anyone missed that, the talk's being recorded and we'll put it on our department website or somewhere if you want to revisit. Yeah, Paige. Brilliant. I'm unfamiliar with that. So thanks to the person chatting in about that. Does this work? That should work. Yeah. Okay.
Can everyone hear me? Okay. So Christy Hammer said, can you hear me? Sociologist Robert Blouner's theory of internal colonialism may be useful here. Those contained mostly controlled by those from the outside, and those that own the stores and teach in the schools leave the bad community at the end of the day, but also have control over it. For example, liquor stores on outskirts of Pine Ridge Reservation are owned by whites, inner cities, etc. Blouner said communities with internal colonialism were often POC and or poor. Second point, Palestine, a clear example missing here, I think, with writing on Israeli settler justification. She says, thank you.
Thank you, Chrissy. Excellent points. And indeed, if you want to watch settler colonialism in action, you can watch what's happening in Israel. Yeah, to the point on Blouner, his theory of internal colonialism, it's a really good one. And I should revisit some of that work. That work has kind of been, I think, unfortunately, submerged and left behind, particularly with the ascent of settler colonialism. But with all the various forms of colonialism, I had to focus in here. So I didn't adopt his framework, but I appreciate Dr. Hammer's reference to that. She's mentioning, of course, the case of White Clay, Nebraska, which you may have seen in the news or read about a number of years ago, where alcohol was banned on the Pine Ridge Reservation. Just south across the border, there was a town called White Clay, which basically was 3 or 4 or 5 white-owned liquor stores, right? And it was tremendously shocking to drive through that area, you know, and there are tribal peoples on the street. There's just it was a real unfortunate situation. Since then, they've been shut down, and luckily, if I remember right, they've been shut down. And I'm not sure where the lawsuit is on that, but yeah, there's a lot of certainly a lot of elements where internal colonialism would be helpful. Anyone else? Yes, go ahead. Right. That's right. That's right. That's right. I was actually, thanks for that. Thanks for that example. I was actually thinking about that last night. I was going to say, you know, the Penobscot live on, and, you know, and that doesn't work. I actually got that insight from a Lakota friend of mine that I collaborate with. It doesn't come from my mind. Perhaps, again, to your point about islands, you know, Patrick Wolf actually argues that reservations sort of represent these islands of incompleteness in the settler colonial project. So maybe, again, they're sort of seen as not fully part of the body politic, but really interesting you brought that up, because I had the same idea, and I'm not sure, to be honest, what the origins of that are. I'd have to ask my friend back home. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, it's an excellent question. As Wendy mentioned, I collaborate with a Lakota Research Center back home on the Pine Ridge Reservation, where I've shared this research, and it's not all that surprising to folks out there, because, again, this is this is sort of part of the mainstream discourse. Anytime there's a racially charged issue in that area, this is the sort of stuff you get from letters to the editor in the newspaper. This is sort of the general discourse. I'm not sure what beyond that. I'm not sure what the next step of this project is. Perhaps it's sort of doing a participant observation of Indigenous activists, looking at their narrative, looking at to see how they're trying to combat this type of dominant discourse. But to your point, this was sort of the project where myself, growing up as a settler descendant in South Dakota, wanted to get this out there because I feel like focus on racism and toward Indigenous peoples, oftentimes we never read about it. But thinking about how this might be useful to tribes is something I've been pondering, and hopefully we'll come up with something. Yeah. Thanks for that. Anyone else? Thanks so much for coming. Appreciate it. Happy to talk to you afterwards if you have other questions or comments.